Hello ladies, today our exciting study of Hebrews chapter 11 covers the names of the heroes and heroines of the Old Testament whom God gave a good testimony, a good witness, and it lists their names, their activities, their sufferings, and then the blessings from God's testimony, their reward, and it was written to strengthen and encourage these first century Christians and us today. Let's look at the outline of chapter 11. Roman number 1 is the description and benefits of faith, verses 1 through 3. We covered those in our last lesson. Today we'll look at the rest of Hebrews, the pre-flood heroes in verses 4 through 7. Then we'll look at Abraham, father of the faithful, in verses 8 through 22. And that includes Abraham and Sarah, 8 through 12. Patient patriarchs, this is the son and grandson and great-grandson of Abraham and Sarah in verses 13 through 16. We'll look at Abraham's faith tested and shared in verses 17 through 22. Then we'll talk about Moses and his faith in verses 23 through 28. We'll look at the faith that was shown in the Exodus when Israel left Egypt and when they conquered Jericho in verses 29 to 31. And then in the final verses of chapter 11, we'll look at other examples of faith. Today, we begin with verse 4, talking about 3 men who were heroes of the faith, and this was before the flood. Let's look at verse 4. We'll talk about Abel. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, his brother, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying, witnessing of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, yet speaks. Abel was the second son of Adam and Eve, and he offered to God an acceptable sacrifice, one of the animals of his flock. His brother Cain offered fruit of the field, but it wasn't acceptable to God, and Cain killed Abel. Why didn't God accept Cain's sacrifice? Let's look at the study guide, page 120. Abel's sacrifice was recorded in Genesis 4, 3 through 5. God accepted his animal sacrifice because he offered it by faith, we just read. Since faith comes by hearing the word of God, Romans 10:17, there had to be divine instruction concerning sacrifices. God told them what to offer. Abel obeyed by offering an animal. Cain did not. And we know that God's plan always included blood. So that was part of God's instruction there. God called Abel a righteous man whose example still speaks. We still read about Abel's sacrifice, that he was blessed because he followed God's instructions by faith. The next pre-flood hero mentioned is Enoch, who it looks like lived like no one else before because he left this earth like no one else before. Let's look at verse 5 of chapter 11. By faith Enoch was translated or changed so that he did not see death and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. Let's look at the study guide's comments on Enoch. Enoch walked with God. This is in Genesis 5:21 to 24. This means they shared a close relationship. For his life of faith, Enoch was taken away. He was translated, taken away from this earth without experiencing death. And when Christ comes again, some will receive this same reward. 1 Corinthians 15:52 and 1 Thessalonians 4:17. Some who are still alive when Christ comes will be taken up, just as Enoch was. Scripture testifies that Enoch pleased God here in verse 5. He pleased God because he had faith. And we read in verse 6 that faith is necessary to please God. Let's read verse 6. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. This faith chapter encourages us to have faith so that we can please God. In verse 7, we read about one who kept alive God's plan for the human race, Noah. Verse 7, by faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, no one had seen a flood before, moved with godly fear or respect. He prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Genesis 6:5-8 gives us the basic story of Noah here. Genesis 6:5-8. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made man. Verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah obeyed God, and God was pleased with him. So God saved him when he was going to destroy the whole world. Noah found grace in the Lord. Oh, that can be said of us. The study guide adds on page 121. The third example, Noah, was known for building the ark. He believed God's word concerning the unseen flood, and with reverential fear, he did according to all that God commanded him. And it says that twice in Genesis 6:22 and in Genesis 7:5. He did according to all that God commanded him. Do we do all that God commands us? If we want to be rewarded like Noah, we need to be diligent in this. God had warned Noah of the flood. It had never rained before, so it took a lot of faith to believe this. Genesis 2:6 says that the earth was watered by a mist. Let's look at 2:6. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the earth. So to believe in a flood took a lot of faith. But Hebrews 11:7 says that he was moved with godly fear. He respected God, and he built this ark, and it saved his household. But by obeying God, it says he condemned the world. Robert Milligan clarified in his commentary, he who gives heed to God's warnings and admonitions condemns by his faith and practice all who neglect to do so. You know, light shines on darkness, and those who love darkness don't want to be around those who walk in the light, because it shows up their evil deeds. So by his light, Noah condemned those who were living in darkness. And he became the heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. He was blessed. God gave a good testimony and called him righteous because he had faith and he did what God said. God rewards faith and obedience. So now the Hebrews writer moves on to that faithful patriarch, the one called a Hebrew, Abraham. This is in part 3 of the outline. We have Abraham, father of the faithful, verses 8-22. And these verses cover several aspects of Abraham's life. In Roman numeral 3, part A, talks about Abraham and Sarah, and then B, the patient patriarchs, and then C, Abraham's faith tested and shared. Let's first look at verses 8-10, which talks about God's call to Abraham and his promises. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would afterward receive as an inheritance. And we read that in Genesis. God called Abraham to go to a land he would show him, and he promised him that land and some other promises. And Abraham, went out not knowing where he was going. Verse 9, by faith he sojourned. He lived in the land of promise as in a foreign country. He didn't own that land, but he lived there believing his descendants would own it, dwelling in tents with Isaac his son and Jacob his grandson, the heirs with him of the same promise. And verse 10, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Let's go on to verse 11, which talks about Abraham's wife Sarah. Now Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 90 when God fulfilled the promise of a son. But let's look at verse 11 to tell how Sarah was able to conceive that child in her old age. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. She was past menopause, but she believed God's promise. So by faith, she was able to conceive. And then in verse 12, we see the fulfillment of God's promise. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead reproductively, 99 years old, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. All the Jewish descendants. God fulfilled his promise. So that promise was made to Abraham back in Genesis 12, but God also repeated that promise to Isaac in Genesis 22:17 and to his son Jacob in Genesis 32:12. And these readers in the first century had seen the promises fulfilled. The innumerable descendants, the possession of the land of promise, and the seed of Abraham blessing the entire world. The study guide on page 122 adds, because of God's promise, Abraham believed his descendants would one day possess the land in which he lived. He also had faith that he and his spiritual descendants would inherit eternal life in the heavenly city. While in Canaan, Abraham's home was a temporary tent. He looked forward with the eye of faith to an eternal, permanent dwelling that God himself would build. So Abraham lived as a stranger in the land, looking forward to heaven. And Neil Lightfoot in his commentary shows that this is the same lot of the first century Christians and us. In his commentary, Lightfoot wrote, the experiences through which Abraham passed were remarkably like the circumstances of the original readers of the epistle. Abraham had received a call to go forth, and they had been summoned to go forth to Jesus outside the camp, taking his stigma. Abraham had wandered about in Canaan, finding no certain home. They too, as strangers and passing travelers on earth, had to look to the eternal city. Those first century Christians knew that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had lived in that promised land, believing it would someday belong to their descendants, and that God would grant them a heavenly home. And God did. Now, I want to point out something interesting about chapter 11. Sarah is one of two women listed in Faith's Hall of Fame, but many people, when they think of Sarah, they remember her doubt. She sent Hagar with Abraham to have that child of promise. So why is she included? Well, the study guide suggests on page 122, perhaps it was because Sarah was not perfect and rose above her failures that she was included. Hebrews 11 does not mention her faults, only her circumstances. She was an example of faith, one of the holy women, and the mother of spiritual daughters who follow her example. It says that in 1 Peter 3, 5, and 6. Sisters, is it not comforting to know that despite our weaknesses, God can count us faithful? Hebrews 11 doesn't mention the faults of these heroes and heroines, only their faith. And the purpose was to strengthen these first century readers. Robert Milligan wrote in his commentary, nothing could better serve to strengthen the hands and encourage the hearts of the desponding and persecuted Hebrews than this reference to the faith of their illustrious ancestor, specifically Sarah. We can see now how these faithful ancestors, their stories, would strengthen the faith of these first century Hebrews, because they could identify with Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob. Do these heroes inspire you? Let's look at part 3, B, the patient patriarchs, Abraham's son, grandson, and great-grandson in verses 13 through 16. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived in the land of Canaan, believing that God would keep his promise and that their descendants would inherit this land. But they themselves lived as strangers in that land and looked forward to their heavenly home. And this is what the Hebrews writer wants Christians to do. Let's look at verses 13 through 16. These, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all died in faith, not having received the promises, that promised land, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them. They had faith. They embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland, a place to put down their roots, and that would be heaven. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. They might have gone back to that homeland where they had roots. if they had not had so much faith. Verse 16, but now, while they were living in this land as strangers, they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Do you see the similarities here between them and these first century Hebrews and Christians today? Living as strangers in a land, not being able to put down permanent roots forever, but looking forward to a heavenly home. Let's look at the study guide, page 123. These faithful tent-dwelling nomads sought not a permanent homeland, but an eternal one. They did as Christians are directed to do. They set their affections on things above and not on things of the earth. That's Colossians 3:2. That's what we are to do. Linsky applied this to those first century Hebrews Christians. He said, as former Jews, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are their examples of faith. See these patriarchs disregard everything in the way of an earthly fatherland, pass through life and die as nothing but aliens among men, aliens in fact, yea, aliens, because they are ever aspiring to a better, a heavenly fatherland, the city of God, prepared for them by God. Will the readers do less? Do we really think about that in the way we live? We are not here permanently. This is not our homeland. We are living here as strangers and pilgrims, aliens, living for God, looking forward to that heavenly home someday. And in Hebrews 11:16, which we read, the writer reminded them that God proudly said he was their God. Let's look at Exodus 3:6. Moreover, God said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God was not ashamed to call them his people. We should not be ashamed to call him our God. But we must have faith. That's what this chapter is all about. God rewards faith. Now we look at part C of Roman numeral 3. Faith tested and shared. This reviews Abraham's test of faith where God called him to sacrifice his son Isaac on Mount Moriah. And we went over that. So we know that account very well. But let's read verses 17 through 19 of Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. In his heart, he gave up Isaac. And he who had received the promises, Abraham, offered up his only begotten son. Verse 18, of whom it was said, talking about Abraham, in Isaac your seed shall be called. God promised descendants through Isaac. So Abraham, verse 19, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. He sacrificed him in his heart, and so figuratively, God raised him up. Abraham passed that test. He sacrificed Isaac in his heart. Let's read study guide page 124. Abraham had mentally given up Isaac for dead. He believed, though, that God would fulfill his promise by resurrecting the boy. In a figurative sense, he received him from the dead, it says in verse 19. God did not want Isaac's life. He wanted Abraham's heart. Later, God reiterated his covenant to Isaac and Jacob, as we mentioned, and that's in Genesis 26:1 through 4 and 28:10 through 14. Each believed and was rewarded. See their faith in that they believed the promises that God had made. They believed their descendants would receive that land, and they lived in that land as strangers. We know that because of statements made on their deathbeds. Let's look at verses 20 through 22. By faith, Isaac, Abraham's son, blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. He talked to them, to his twin sons. Verse 21, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. And he talked to them about the promises God would fulfill. And by faith, Joseph, in verse 22, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel. He knew they were going to leave Egypt and go to possess that promised land one day. And he gave instructions concerning his bones, that they would take his bones and bury them in that promised land. The faith of these patriarchs. Abraham had faith. He passed this faith on to his descendants. There's a lesson there for us and for these first century Hebrew Christians. Let's look at the study guide. Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau through faith in unseen matters. And that's in Genesis 27, 26 to 29 and verses 38 to 40. Jacob blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, with faith in God's promises for the future. That's in Genesis 48, 14 to 20. And Joseph asked that his bones be buried in the promised land when his descendants would possess it. And that's in chapters 49 and 50. And then they did so in Joshua 24. This Hebrews letter reminds readers that God keeps his promises. And that should inspire faith in Christian readers. So now we are on part 4 of the outline. And here the Hebrews writer names Moses, the great deliverer who brought the children of Israel out of Egypt up to the edge of the promised land. But the writer first cites the faith of Moses' parents, the faith that Moses imitated. Faith is something that is passed down and inspired by faithful men and women. Hebrews 11:23 notes that Moses' parents refused to obey the evil edict of that Pharaoh. Pharaoh wanted all the Hebrew boys killed, but they didn't. They hid their son for 3 months. They obeyed God. They believed God would deliver that baby and them for disobeying the king's evil edict. Let's read verse 23. Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. There's a lesson there. Obey God. And don't worry about what the world can do to us, because God rewards faith. Let's look at page 125. Moses, the great mediator of God's old covenant, was also on the list. His faith, influenced by his parents, was often noted. Moses was born in a sad time in Hebrew history. To prevent population growth, Pharaoh commanded all Hebrew male babies to be thrown into the Nile River. But Moses' parents saw that he was a beautiful child and hid him 3 months. They trusted God for his preservation. Exodus 2 records his placement in a basket in the Nile and his adoption by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses' mother Jochebed was rewarded for her faith. She was allowed to nurse him and teach him about his true heritage. Joseph Exell in the Pulpit Commentary wrote, "Hence he would go to the Egyptian court with a knowledge of his country's woe and his father's God." We must teach our children about God, pass on our faith, so they will grow up to follow him and receive the reward also. And we see that Moses followed the example of his parents' faith. Let's read verses 24 to 27 about Moses when he grew up. 24 to 27, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward of faith and following God. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him, God, who is invisible. Such a lesson there for us. Page 125. Raised in Pharaoh's house, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7:22, but he held to his parents' faith. As an adult, he rejected the splendor of Egypt, its treasures, power, and privilege, the fleeting pleasures of sin, and chose God's people, a nation of slaves with their poverty, contempt, and affliction. He accepted the kind of rejection and abuse that afflicted Christ and those who follow him. Moses believed the promise not only that God's people would possess Canaan, but he would someday enter into God's heavenly rest. Such an example for us. And Moses showed his faith to all of Israel and to Pharaoh in the 10 plagues. And that final plague, the death of the firstborn, the results are mentioned here in verse 28. By faith, He, Moses, kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And all those who imitated Moses' faith and put the blood on the doorpost, their firstborns were saved. They were blessed for their faith. Page 125. With an eye of faith, Moses represented the King of heaven by boldly demanding of Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Exodus 9:1. He pronounced the 10 plagues and inaugurated the Hebrew Passover. For this memorial, he instructed the Israelites to sprinkle lamb's blood over their doorposts to protect their firstborn. This was all done by faith. Moses passed on his faith. He inspired faith in the Israelites. They followed him out of Egypt. And then, all the way up to the edge of the Red Sea, they looked back and saw the Egyptian army coming, and their faith waned. But Moses showed faith again. At God's command, he held up that rod and said, "See the salvation of the Lord." And the sea parted, and the Israelites walked across on dry land. And then the Egyptians were drowned in the waters as God made them come back together again. But Israel was delivered because of the faith of Moses. Hebrews then reminded readers of another deliverance 40 years later, when Joshua led them to the promised land and they needed to conquer the first city over the Jordan River, and that was Jericho. We read about that in Hebrews 11 verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. And they marched around the city as God said, and those walls fell down as God said. Their faith was rewarded. And there was a woman living in that city, Rahab. She's the second woman to be mentioned in Faith's Hall of Fame. She was delivered because of her faith. Let's look at verse 31. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, all the others in Jericho, when she had received the spies with peace. She hid the spies because she believed in God, and she asked to be delivered, she and her family, and God rewarded her for her faith. Let's look at page 126. Israel's second generation learned from the first and crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, Joshua 3. They marched around the walls of Jericho toward a victory seen only through faith. One woman, Rahab, was saved from the destruction because she shared the Israelites' faith. Rahab was named not only in Hebrews 11, but also in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1. Those who diligently seek God and believe are rewarded. And we saw that in Hebrews 11:6. Hebrews proclaims God rewards those who believe in Him and obey Him. And the purpose is to inspire faith and hope in God's promises and to motivate Christians to persevere all the way to the end, even if that end means martyrdom for faith. All right, we're in the final verses of Hebrews 11, and it talks about other examples of faith, verses 32 to 40. Hebrews 11, 32 to 40 presents more models of biblical faith. Let's look at verse 32. And what more shall I say? He didn't have time to write more, for the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. The writer wants readers to imitate faith and the endurance of these men. The Hebrews readers would, like these men, receive God's reward, and Christians need such reminders in times of trouble and in persecution. And we notice that it keeps mentioning the faith of these people, but not their flaws. But they had flaws. Think of David and Bathsheba, Samson and Delilah, of Jephthah and the vow he made concerning the sacrifice that happened to be his daughter. It mentions their faith, not their flaws. It is a chapter to inspire us. R.N.C. Linsky, in his commentaries, called this a gallery of notable portraits of ancient great believers, each drawn with a master hand. They all believed the unseen. They all trusted a promise, things for which they had to wait and hope. One grand characteristic makes them all kin, and that is faith. So we'll look at some sufferings and persecutions that were endured by unnamed others in verses 33 and 34. He ends 32 talking about the prophets, and 33 says, who, through faith, subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. And we can identify some of these. Think of Elijah, who escaped the edge of the sword, and Daniel, who stopped the mouths of lions. But he doesn't have time to name all of these. He just shows what some of God's people endured because of their faith. And then he says in verse 35, there were women who received their dead, raised to life again. Remember the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman? Their sons were raised by prophets Elijah and Elisha. God rewards faith. Page 127 adds, because readers needed encouragement in persecution, the writer listed sufferings endured by the faithful. These chose to accept torture rather than miss their reward, the better resurrection. While many lived in Old Testament times, scholars include intertestamental incidences closer to the reader's lifetime. 2 Maccabees' historical accounts reveal the tortures of a man named Eleazar and of a woman and her 7 sons who were mutilated, flayed, and roasted in fire. What some people have been through for their faith, but they receive a reward. And Hebrews 11 lists other gruesome activities that God's people went through, verses 36 and 37. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. The writers wanted these Hebrew Christians in the first century to understand that God's people faced persecution and endured to the end rather than deny their faith. And that's what he wanted to inspire these Hebrew readers to do, and to inspire us should we ever find ourselves facing persecution and the temptation to deny our faith. Verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Some of them didn't have a home either, but they were looking for that heavenly home. Page 128. Sisters, our trials pale in comparison with these godly sufferers who inspire us. These models of faith lived before Christ. They are commended for their faith in God's promise of a new high priest and a better covenant. Only by faith did they envision the hoped-for blessing. And verse 39 says, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. While they didn't receive the promise of Christ, they looked forward to it. And we in the New Age do receive that promise. Let's read the last 2 verses of Hebrews 11. And all these heroes and heroines, having obtained a good testimony, a good report through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Lightfoot in his commentary stated, to them belonged the promise, to the saints of the New Age belongs the fulfillment. It's in the New Age that the better things are provided, the better covenant with complete forgiveness of sins, the better hope, and so on. The study guide adds, concerning these last 2 verses, those that are listed, those who died before Christ, were not cleansed apart from the Christianity we enjoy, because the blood of Christ made them whole too. And Lightfoot beautifully summarized in his commentary, thus the author has come again to the main thrust of the epistle. It was because of faith that the men of old were attested to. Verse 2, the testimony applied to them. A faith that surrendered all. This was the glory of Israel's heritage, from the blood of Abel to the martyrdom of the Maccabean zealots. Yet even so, this was but a preparation, a scheme of preliminary measures that find their true meanings only in Christ. In Him alone there is hope. Why then should the readers of the epistle forsake their only way of salvation, the only one through whom could be obtained the promises the fathers never quite realized? The correct answer to this question, logically deduced from biblical proofs, was to the author the surest antidote for apostasy. So this was the purpose of the Hebrews letter. It was to stop the downward spiral to apostasy, and encourage these Christians in faith to have faith and to endure through this persecution, to persevere all the way to the end. So let's read the summary in the study guide, the summary of chapter 11, the forward look at chapter 12. This is on page 129. This chapter, chapter 11, focused on the importance of faith. The writer listed the names of faithful ancients with their good works and rewards. These included Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Rahab, and more. Many others suffered. They never received the promises on earth, but were commended for their faith. In Hebrews 12, we will read about the spiritual place promised to Christians, called Zion. It's a difficult journey, so the writer encouraged spiritual travelers to help the weak, pursue peace, and beware of ingratitude and defiance against God. The first question is, why is faith important in our spiritual journey? And second, among the heroes and heroines named in Hebrews 11, whose life of faith inspires you the most, and why? Well, I hope that this chapter has inspired you to have more faith and to believe in God's promises, and that He will reward our faith with that heavenly home.